It's a mystery why one kid gets interested in science, another kid might be drawn to music, another kid will be a visual person. I was that visual kid, there's no doubt about it. I was always drawn to the art room at school when I was small. But I can remember one moment when you're just a child, you're just drawing out of the creative fountain that's coming out of you. But I remember going in the stock room where the teacher kept all the materials and seeing this pile of art magazines, just thin magazines with only one coloured illustration, which was the cover, and seeing an amazing painting by El Greco. It wasn't the realism, it wasn't anything to do with the depiction of the scene, it was the vivacity that his brushstrokes gave to the human beings and the landscape. I just must have realised, wow, this is what art can do. I want to be part of that, you know. At the moment that you're creating any individual work, you don't really realise how it's going to fit into a pattern. But standing back now, after 10, 15, 20 years of working, I can see that it did build up into a personal myth that was way, way more interesting and complex. More interesting than anything I could invent consciously, and related to my internal life and the external events of my life in a much more organic and interesting and knitted together way. Of the characters who appeared in my work, it's a bit like improvised theatre. So it's a bit like having certain characters that you feel are part of your cast of characters, and allowing them on stage, the stage of the canvas, and allowing them to invent a scene right there in front of your eyes, because they've come on stage. They've got backstories, but they haven't got a plot in mind. They tend to be people who have some kind of psychic resonance for you. They're people that you're interested in. If you stop to notice your interests and your involvements and maybe your fascinations with people, then you realise, if you take a step back, that that's coming from a certain place, and that person is somehow symbolically active in your imagination. It's those people that I've used. So some of them are friends, some of them are family, some of them are acquaintances, some of them are cultural figures from the past. It's a whole cast of characters, some alive, some dead, some completely invented. The characters come and go seemingly as they wish. So this one's called Flatlands. We've got Clement Greenberg, the bald figure in the dark suit there, an art critic who I once met in the late 1980s in New York. I'd read books by this guy, and he was quite old by then, and I bumped into him in the foyer of the Whitney Museum, and I just sat down and started to chat to him. Unbeknown to me, he has become one of these characters who seems to insistently come back into the work. So there are many pictures that feature Clement Greenberg, and he's become my emblem, my metaphor of a kind of rational self, a removed self, the critical self, the person who is removed from the work, who's passing judgment on it in a way. On the ground, as a kind of immaterial creature, we've got Mandy Rice Davis. So Mandy Rice Davis was what was known in those days, in the 60s, as a call girl. She got involved in a scandal with the government where I think she was seeing a government minister at the same time. She was seeing a guy from the Russian embassy when it came to court. She's very famous for her statement, well, he would say that. This is after somebody claimed not to have known her, I suppose, and she said, well, he would say that. And there's something about that phrase that sticks in my mind as somebody who has a real character of being able to tell the truth, even in a very intimidating place such as a court. When she was surrounded by august figures, she was just a 22-year-old or something like that, and yet she spoke the truth. Shocking truth that even somebody who had put his hand on the Bible and said, I will give evidence and speak nothing but the truth, was not going to speak the truth. And she had the nous to identify that and to tear open the fabric of whatever the fabric of the situation in the courtroom was, that there was some kind of cover-up trying to be constructed. So she's a truth teller, and she's also an opener up of surfaces. He's wrestling her to the ground. You can see he's got a grip on her left hand. She's holding a Stanley knife, and he's trying to prevent her from making any more slits in these Kenneth Noland abstract early 1960s paintings, which are reproduced there. Greenberg was extremely involved in a movement in art which wished for the canvas to remain a canvas rather than a window through which you depict the world. So he was kind of the king of flatness, the canvas as a thing in itself, not attempting to represent the world. So it puts up a kind of barrier to the idea of a picture which is something you can see through. So Clement and Mandy fighting in my paintings, as they often do, is a battle between the cover-up and the reveal. So she's like a suffragette. You know, the suffragettes went into the National Gallery and sliced up the Rokeby Venus. She's attempting to open the two-dimensional surfaces of these famously flat Kenneth Nolands that Greenberg was a great champion of. In my teens, I was obsessed with science, and with this one experiment in particular called the double slit experiment, where particles of light, photons, are passed through two slits in a screen. The experiment shows that the particle goes through both slits. There are two slits in this wall, and an object fired towards them goes through both simultaneously. The scientific explanation is that the particle is in fact a wave, and when it goes through the slits, it's a wave. It's only us measuring, observing the particle that collapses it into particulateness. And this extends up into larger scales than just sort of subatomic physics. It seemed intrinsically interesting. It seemed amazing that the things of the world, matter, is both immaterial and material. And here's an experiment that demonstrates it. However, looking back now, I think to myself, that was not just intrinsically interesting to you, that was symbolically interesting to you. And what my little teenage brain was interested in was the symbol that the material and the immaterial were somehow the same thing. And why that was consoling to me, because that was the reason I was interested in it, I think, the consolation that that offered was that I was a body and a soul. And that despite the teachings of materialist science, which I was brought up within in my schooling, which somehow denies the existence of the soul, that here was something which made it much more complicated, and which my symbol-needing psyche could latch onto as a consoling evidence that I was a soul, as well as a body. We talked about the double slit experiment, so here they are in another way. Greenberg's managed to prevent her from opening the fourth slit. There were only 3 there. She was going to open 2 on each canvas. What would happen if she opened the 4th slit? Yeah, what would happen? On the ground there were lots of sort of force field lines, which you can see that they're sort of tangled in, which are the wave fronts passing through the slits. So I suppose if she opened the 4th slit, the wave fronts would all meet. And it's as if these figures are part of the waves that have passed through the double slits from behind. From behind the canvases, from that non-space, that mental space, non-spatial space. It's as if they've come through the slits, and if she opened the 4th slit, it would allow her to materialize more. The moment she's kind of ghostly, she'll become real in that space there, which he is desperate to prevent. There are also wounds as well. Wounds one receives in childhood, so that your will and your emotions are curtailed by society, really. You know, you're having to rein in your desires and suppress your emotional reaction. That's the passage of a child into adulthood. So these double slits, I think, have got double meanings for me, you know. In terms of Blake, we've got Clement Greenberg. He's my horizon. He's the representation of the part of the self that censors the other parts. So he's a force of repression for me. He has, you know, other more positive characteristics in that he's a kind of shaper of things as well. He's a seer of boundaries. So he's not all negative, but on the whole, when he comes into the paintings, he tends to be in battle. Blake had a series of characters who fight each other for supremacy in his mythic world. And Urizen is the kind of the rationalist, the judge, you know, all the qualities that Clement manifests, really. So he's my Urizen. The improv theatre that interests me most is Commedia dell'arte, which is famously a kind of Venetian manifestation of that improvised tradition. It is a bit like that I've got my own kind of Commedia dell'arte troupe. Over the years, all the figures in this cast of characters have established their backstories in a way, but when they come into the paintings, it really is like when you hear a novelist say the characters begin to write themselves in a novel. It's that kind of display that you can sit back and watch. It's an extraordinary experience. My heroes. Philip Guston. This is him nearing the end of his life, and he'd gone to talk in Minneapolis and a wonderful talk about his work. He's another artist who works out of with a blank canvas, with no ideas, and just allows things to occur. Kunisada, Japanese ukiyo-e artist. I collect Japanese prints. It's the formal qualities of the prints. They're endlessly inventive and surprising to the eye. And Kunisada, depicted by his pupil. That's the master. He's the most wonderful and most prolific of all the Japanese print artists. I've been lucky to be obsessed all my life with this one thing. I painted as a teenager. I mean, obviously, all kids paint, it just comes out of them. And then I wanted to make art when I woke up into being semi-adult, and I was a landscape painter. I was obsessed, in love with the landscape paintings of this guy called Alfred Sisley. He was an English-born impressionist. I mean, he was French to all intents and purposes. He was pals with Monet and Renoir and Pissarro and people like that. But there was something in the quiet sort of modesty of his palette and the structure. It was more structured than, say, a Monet or something like that. There was just something about those formal qualities, the modesty of the greys, the quietness of the structure that fitted my soul at that point. When you get drawn to a painting or a painter, that's you. You are seeing something essential about yourself in that person's work. I think I was a kind of quiet, introspective kid, and it would have been a mirror of my inner self at that point. Then I got into art history, and I studied art history instead of art, sort of under parental influence, with the idea that one might be able to get a proper job if you had an academic calling. And so I got completely seduced by the academic life. I was in this museum in London, and my whole creative life was making exhibitions, writing about art history. It is a creative activity, but it's hidden from people who do that it is a personal project. And there was a moment, I guess, when I realised, looking back over 10 years of being a museum curator, that everything I'd done in terms of writing and exhibitions had all been covertly, because I wasn't aware of it, involved in asking the deep questions about the world, society, nature, culture, humanity. It was something in me that needed to answer those questions. And when I woke up to that fact, then I realised I had a subject for art. And so instead of doing it through writing art history, I thought, why not cut out the camouflage and just make art? So I got back into that at age 32. I'd been not misrouted into academia, but I mean, I think it was essential for me in some way. I needed that gestation period before the true self could be born. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but
We've got a tin full of ones that are in terps, dirty, things that I should have cleaned up last week probably.
we all dream every night, so the neuroscientists tell us, but I prefer to daydream on canvas. What I discovered was that I found it boring to illustrate dreams. So something alive and something that one experiences, the morning after, and you remember the dream, that's a fantastically enlivening moment, and it's fantastic to experience gradually being able to decipher some of the messages that are coming across. But to then illustrate that on canvas just didn't work for me. I found it tedious to do that. This whole process of daydreaming on canvas, I think of the work that I've made in the last 20 years, it's not so much art, okay, it's painting, but it's the gathering of data. Although I want the paintings to have a certain power, I guess, to them, that's not the important thing. The enunciation of them in an interesting and beautiful or powerful way, it's there, but the central interest in making a painting for me is receiving the data that, working in this daydreaming manner, can actually bring out for you. Layering up like this and just unsure what's going to happen, unsure what figure's going to come through, just aware that this is a means of passing the time. It's also producing something to fight against. It's very hard to paint on a blank canvas, so when you've got something like this, when a figure comes in, often you just want to cancel everything that's around it, but there was something that allowed it to come in really quickly. And none of it might survive. And I can show you shots that I took of early stages of paintings where it looks something like this, and then the whole thing disappears and a figure appears. It's as soon as a figure starts to appear, then you suddenly realize where the figure is situated. So it might be somewhere else, might be a figure in Venice or something like that, in which case all of that goes, all of that disappears. Over the 20 years that I've been painting in this daydreaming way, that a similar mythic iconography has emerged. It's a similar story that's being told. The myth is the same, has the same shape, but it's clothed in different metaphorical apparel, I guess. It's not always easy to discover the similarities unless you look beneath the surface of the imagery. But it's been really interesting to discover that the same things that are being explored in the night dreams also have a life in the studio, in here, when I'm painting and following my intuitions. And that feels extremely random often. So when you're on an individual painting, there's quite often a little voice that's going, nah, that's just a whim, Chris. That's not the real subject. But if you push through and disregard that voice and you follow that whim, always turns out to be completely on the nail as to what you should be investigating. And the voice that says it's a whim is some part of you that is nervous about knowing that truth or something. It's a fascinating process. When I'm working, I have no specific ideas when I come into the studio. When you film me painting those fields of brushstrokes, that's the moment of being in the studio, just busily fiddling around and allowing the daydream to start to form. That is like as if this room is a seance room. And it feels to me as if some of the characters that I've established as symbolic people who appear in the paintings, it's like waiting for one of those to knock on the wall and say, I would like to come into the painting. When the process starts, you allow that to happen. Very often another character will want to come in too, and sometimes want to nudge that one out of the way, the original one that came in. Or sometimes they'll stay together, and sometimes there'll be harmony between them, sometimes disharmony. And gradually the painting gets built from that. People are representations that the psyche has screen grabbed to to represent itself. So the dreamer's psyche is always looking for elements, objects, events, people that are metaphorically useful to it in order to describe the movements within the psyche. There's something in one that constructs the dreams, and it isn't the normal conscious self. It's not the self I think I am at the moment when I'm talking to you. There's another self inside that is the dream sender, and it constructs the dreams. It has its own will, and it has its own point of view. And there are so often dreams that if you begin to be able to read your dreams, the dreams are messages to self from the dream sender entity. I mean, is it a person or is it some kind of organic, almost like a thermostat part of the self that seems to be wiser than the conscious, rational self, the everyday self, the self that's talking to you right now? So that's why dreams are important to me. Realizing that there was something within one that had a kind of wisdom. It's more than wisdom, it's more like a loving, the whole unconditional love idea expressed in, the Catholic vision of the Virgin with her arms spread, inviting embrace. When you see those statuettes in Roman Catholic churches, and she's in blue, and she's young, and she looks down, it's like, come unto me, the little children kind of thing. So the entity, the person within who formulates the dreams, has those qualities of almost divine wisdom, but also a loving, caring attitude towards the conscious part of the self. So the conscious part seems to be, from the point of view of the dream sender, often going off in random directions that are not always appropriate to the good of the whole system, the whole self. And it seems like the job of the dream sender is like a homeostatic device that rebalances you. And it was the discovery through dreams and through taking dreams seriously all those years ago, even though I was the kind of person who was the least interested in dreams, finding out that there is this element to the inner person that's able to watch over that outward conscious self and protect you from going off the rails, out of kilter, out of balance too much. That was fascinating for me. So just the fact that we are not one unitary self, and that there is some other entity which has its own volition and its own point of view. That inner universe was fascinating to me. It took over from an interest in something like cosmology to the outer universe. It sort of collapsed in on itself and became an interest in the inner universe. It was through dreams that occurred in me. Yes, it is honest, because the layer of the self that one is allowing to come out isn't conditioned by social requirements, or isn't conditioned by all the learning that you've had dumped into you through schooling and through parents and all the rest of it. You're accessing a part of the self that is fully yourself and not what people wanted you to be by being socialized, by entering into language. So when at a baptism the priest puts the candle in front of the baby's face, which is symbolizing the Christianizing of that child in terms of the baptism. It's also that child's inception into the Christian society, which is a whole linguistic world. And that is similar to what's happening when you are being educated at school, or even when you are just learning language as a child. You're being colonized by language. And the Aboriginal, in the original sense of that word, the autochthonous self, the native self, is being colonized by language and colonized by society. And this process is decolonizing the self. To put it in contemporary fashionable parlance, that's what happens. Both of them are valid. That's the thing. It's not to say that I privilege the inner self, the Aboriginal self, over that part of the self which is colonized by society, by learning and all, by language. They should exist in a balanced unity. The whole problem with the West, as I see it, is that we are over-colonized by language and rationality. And rather than there being a balance between the two kinds of self, we're way out of kilter. And I feel the benefits of rebalancing myself. Being fully both of those things. That was Blake's thing as well. I mean, the thing about Blake, when I was first trying to understand what on earth he was doing in his work, this figure of Urizen comes up, and when people who are political who look at Blake are interested in his kind of revolutionary resistance to monarchy and all the rest of it, authority and to rationalism, but they see it as external to him in the American Revolution and the French Revolution and all these things that were happening during his lifetime. And the Urizen figure that he personifies those rationalistic elements as, they see as a figure that he fights with in the outside world. And there was a moment when I realised, no, it's not just in the outside world. The reason Blake gets out of bed in the morning is because Urizen is in him. And he has to fight him every day. And Blake fights Urizen on a daily basis for years, until around about 1800, when he embraces Urizen with a kind of loving embrace. And at that moment, the Urizen figure cools down from his incandescent, raging, rationalistic, judgmental self, and becomes part of the total Blake, the whole Blake. And Blake after 1800 is a unity of all the internal forces, rather than just demonizing one of them. And when I come in the studio, I'm stupid. I come in and somehow my brain turns to jelly, porridge. I can't think. It's really, really weird. I can think at home, I can write books, blah, blah, but when I come in the studio, something happens to me. If I try to think, I get depressed. I can feel the energy draining out of me, the well-being. It physically feels like I'm going into a kind of depression. It's only when I come in and just be that comfortable really stupid person who makes a cup of coffee and then waits for a figure to appear, that it works. And I feel right. I feel right when that's happening. And it's because the language is a pictorial language. The part of me that speaks picture language needs to be dominant in this place. I reach into the dark to bring it out into the light, I guess. This whole sequence of paintings from about 2006 onwards, the generic title for the whole sequence is To Reach Inside a Vault. The vault of the unconscious, I guess. So this one's called The Black Painting, and I did it in 2008. And it's sort of deceptively simple, but it needs a bit of preamble really. So this is where Blake comes in. And so what he famously does is to build a new mythology based on his own personal experience of his interior world. In a way, he's a psychologist. He's about 100 years before Freud and Jung, but he's as sophisticated as Freud and Jung were. Freud and Jung had terminology, a verbal terminology. Blake did, to an extent. He named some of the energies within him, and his language is a symbol language, really. That he builds a big system. It's like a cathedral in Blake's case. I mean, he built it from the ground up, and it ramified and ramified until it was exquisitely intricate. I guess I've always been attracted to making something similar. I wanted to describe the workings of my inner life. The temptation was to try to follow Blake's example and create a personal mythology which describes the workings of the psyche and its path as it has developed over your life. So I started that in the late 90s, and I started with a series called the Mancunian Heresy. This used various symbols from my knowledge about science, fission and fusion and cell division and all the rest of it. Again, it ramified it beautifully into an intricate system, and I made paintings from it, and all seemed well. The year 2000, I was thinking, this is going to roll. It's going to be a fertile way of working. But it didn't work out that way. After the initial creation of the images to do with the kind of overall mythic system that I'd invented, it wasn't fertile. I just kept repeating it in various manifestations. It just seemed to be something that I either recycled it or left it alone. And after a couple of years, I realised that I needed something else. And so I gave up that way of working, where one is working from theory, not so much theory, working from an intellectually derived position and something prior to the work. So the mythic system exists prior to the work. So I gave up, and I kind of lay down on this floor and just thought, that doesn't work. And then there was a moment of abandoning hope of ever working in that way. And you can't pretend to abandon something and have it work for you. You have to really let go. I'd given it my best shot working in that way. So I honestly gave up all hope. And as I got up from that moment of letting go completely of any hopes of working in that way, it just all seemed to come as if I just knew that whatever was going to come next would be the right thing, even though it wasn't coming out of any preconceived intellectual structure. So I started painting these dumb paintings, and also gave up beauty in a funny kind of way, because they're painted in a really kind of gauche fashion. The whole thing was just to kind of get them down and not think too much about them. I began to realise what they were was this kind of painting where, this is the front of the painting and this is the back of the painting, okay? And the painting had opened up like that, so that the spine is the edge of the painting with the staples in it there, and that thing you see on the left with the cross is the back of the painting, back of the canvas, and the right side of the canvas, the black bit, is the painted surface of the front of the painting. It's just opened up like that, but that black surface has a staircase painted on it. It gives the illusion of it actually being a doorway that leads down into a cellar or something like that. But in fact, it's not, it's a flat surface. And the thing that interested me most about these splayed paintings, where it's as if the two-dimensional surface of the canvas, front and back, had been razored down the middle to open to another dimension, a non-dimensional space. I mean, it's an impossible geometry. There's no way that could ever be in the material world. And I guess it must have represented the space of the imagination, where one imagines spaces, one can imagine rooms, one can imagine the cosmos, if you like, the huge spaces between galaxies. It's a non-dimensional space inside the mind. And I think this must have been something to do with these splayed paintings. And yet there's more. You feel like you're invited to go down the steps. Now, it's said that the whole series of paintings since about this time has been called To Reach Inside a Vault. That left-hand bit of black there is the vault. So let's talk about the kind of daydream element before I knew how this one was going to turn out. So it began, you have to imagine a figure in a black suit seated on a ladder-back chair. This character, and there was a Why? No idea. It seemed to be the seed that seemed to want to get planted. So there was a character sitting there with his hand on his chin, looking over to the left on this ladder-back chair. Then at a certain point, the ladder-back chair disappeared, and you have to imagine there was no landscape around it at all. It was just a bare canvas. And then this huge tortoise appeared that he's sitting on. At that point, his suit began to kind of change into this multicoloured, I don't know what you would call it. It's clothing, but who knows if it's a kind of cape or something or other he's got over his shoulder. So it sat for a week or two with me slightly bemused as to what was going to happen. And then I began to realise that it was a kind of night scene. And so I painted in the dark upper part of the canvas and put in this lower part, which seems to be like a featureless field, maybe of mist. I mean, it's got this sort of misty horizon here, some indeterminate distance. The focus of the character, who seemed to be looking out in this direction, was, after a week or two, the thing that really involved me. And so I decided I'd add a canvas and see where he was looking out into this distance on the left. This is the Daydream building, so the point when I feel in contact with the subject of the painting, which up until this point has been kind of unknown to me, is when I start to speculate about what's going on with the character. So I wanted to know where he was looking, and it occurred to me that he was looking out onto an ocean surface. Somehow he was sort of on the edge of the ocean. It wasn't just a regular, uncomplicated ocean. It seemed to want to be a representation of an ocean. So, in other words, it's a stage flat. These feet here are the kind of feet that school plays used to have for the stage scenery. So it wasn't very sophisticated. So it was as if this was the beginnings of an image of a wavy ocean painted onto a piece of canvas that was being stood up on these feet. And that's why it remains this kind of almost graphic, cartoony sort of appearance. At this point, I wanted to find out what was behind him as well, and so it opened up into this giant panoramic landscape. And at one point, this sarcophagus, this kind of Egyptian sarcophagus mummy, was stood up behind him, right here. But it didn't last for very long. For some reason, the Egyptian coffin toppled over and rests exactly where it is now. And then I started to put in these representations. They're like mats, but they're actually representations of Manhattan, New York, with the tunnels, the Midtown Tunnel, Midtown Bridge coming through the centre of the island, with the various connecting tunnels and bridges down at the head of the island. And then they kind of proliferated into this kind of strange web of different ones in different positions. When I say making paintings is collecting data, often the data doesn't get read immediately. So, you just take confidence in the fact that it's going to be a meaningful data production, and then you wait until you get some insights into it. Oh, one of the last things that went in was this kind of almost looks like raindrops, but I meant them as a meteor storm. So they're like the trajectories of tiny meteorites, micro-meteorites, as they enter the atmosphere. So he's in a meteor shower, this character. Oh, and the head opened up so that this face looking out here has an interior face as well, which seems to be revealed in the inside of the head area there. I mean, just to say it's a human being a primate, an ape, sitting on a reptile. Now, instantly, in my mind, that connects immediately with brain structure. Neuroscientists always talk about the central part of the brain as being the reptile brain, and that the surrounding, more recently evolved areas of the brain are the mammalian brain, and then finally the layer of the neocortex, the layer with memory, consciousness, rationality, language. The layer with language is a kind of primate brain, the last layer of the brain. So the idea of a primate, an ape sitting on a reptile, suddenly rang bells for me. That painting is called The Darkling Plain, and it's a line from a wonderful poem by Matthew Arnold called Dover Beach. Very, very moving poem for me for some reason. I couldn't read it aloud without choking up, and I don't know why. He speaks of the darkling plain at the end of it, and that big painting, that strange moonlit field that it's in the night with the sort of meteor shower, that is the darkling plain to me. Not only does it occur in that painting, it occurs in my metaphor world. When I'm asked to talk about how it is to manifest things from the unconscious and then take a step out to look at what you've done, I think that there's a moment just at that leaving the studio mode when I'm aware of the darkling plane. So I'm aware as if all my past works are out there in the dark, like cities on this plane. And away in the distance, there are all the paintings I'm yet to paint as cities and towns. And that somehow in that studio mode, you're in a kind of simultaneous mode where all time is now, and there's this really strange feeling that you're just moving into the future, and that these paintings will come, and that in a weird way they're already there. That's an uncanny feeling, and yet it feels true to what the studio experience is. And that's what keeps you coming back to the studio. That's the addiction. That's what you want. That's what you want to experience. Being in that mode and feeling that you're existing in this simultaneous, eternal now that's also the past and the present. It's a weird thing. This was one of the first paintings that I made after a long period of only writing. So there was a period of about 2 or 3 years when I was only involved in writing art history. When I'm using the verbal part of my mind, the logical, the writer part of me, it somehow interferes with the painter part of me. It's as if the two people use two different languages. The painter part is only using objects, things, scenes, people as its language. In the way that dreams speak a language, but it's a language of analogy where the objects, scenes and people in the dreams are the verbs and nouns in the sentence that the dream sender is constructing for you. That's what happens in the studio. That's why when I come in the studio, I literally can't think. I mean, I come in here and somehow I'm stupid. It's the precondition for allowing the dream sender, the daydreamer, to speak its language. And yet, if I step out of the studio and go back to my writing desk at home, then I'm a very different creature. I'm using this verbal part of the brain. This picture language, this non-verbal language, comes from deeper than the layer of the last part of the evolutionary layer, the kind of primate mammalian brain. The stuff that the dream sender is constructing comes from another part of the brain below that. Not many people know it, and I was shocked to discover it myself, that the neocortex, the part of the brain in which language and memory and consciousness operate, is only 2 millimeters thick. It's almost a cloth thin sheet wrapping the 1,200, 1,300 cubic centimeters of the rest of the brain, like a canvas. Yes. You know Clement Greenberg, I talked to you about Clement Greenberg, that he was interested in the painting retaining its two-dimensionality. You know, that seems to resonate with this subject matter as well. Not quite straight. One of the strange things that allows my process to properly work, I think, is the fact that when I come in the studio and be my stupid self, and these things begin when they do begin, because sometimes they don't, and then I work in that thoughtless way and allow things to occur that then in retrospect seem to have been meant and seem to have a coherence across not only the image that's appeared, but also all the rest of the images that have appeared. Then when I leave the studio, then I revert to curator mode. And then I think about what has just happened. So there's this kind of wave motion, being in the studio, being in the unconscious, and then coming out and thinking about what happened. And then the next time there'll be a dip into the unconscious world of the studio. Somehow it's not circular, it's a spiral because of that having been in and out. And so this one follows on because this ocean pattern is a similar graphic style to the stage flat that was on the left of that picture that we just looked at. The daydream that appeared from speculating as to what was behind the stage flat led to this picture. The reason that they're this shape and that half of his head is cut off here is because they're inside a stage curtain, and this is the edge of the stage curtain. There's obviously a kind of slit that they're, or she, the female character here, is emerging from. When I begin to involve myself in what might be going on, I'm thinking that she seems to be emerging into the stage area of the theatre, and he's behind the stage curtain in the backstage, The backstage area, that whole thing that I said about the ocean representing the field-like qualities of the unconscious and the realm in which the dream sender lives and constructs dreams from, I think of backstage as yet another version of that. If the ocean says it in one register, then backstage says it in another. You know, I'm 66 now, and one of the things I've noticed looking back is that there's a kind of trajectory to the kind of questions that one's asking and answering unconsciously. In early life, you don't know even that you're on it. And in midlife, you don't even really know that you're on it. And if you're lucky, towards the end of your life, you begin to realize that there has been this trajectory. This painting comes at the end of the trajectory of my life, from being 15, 16 maybe, just at that moment when you come into proper being, you come into consciousness in a different way than a child anyway. You're beginning into your adulthood and you're coming into the world with a set of questions, it seems to me, that you don't know you're asking, and sometimes you might discover later on that they are about your place in society, questioning your place in the world, in the universe. You know, I mean, it can be quite wide. You don't know you're asking these. Maybe it's about trying to situate yourself, but maybe it's just curiosity. Maybe it's just the marveling of a new mind coming into being in the universe and being amazed and asking questions about that. That's the beginning of the trajectory at that age. And then throughout one's early adulthood, you get involved in lots of activities, interests, your work, the things that you read. All of these things, although you don't know it at the time, are motivated by those questions that are being asked without you really understanding that you're asking any questions. This is how it appears to me after looking back on my life. So the work one does, and in my case, in my 20s, I wasn't an artist. I was an art historian. I was working in a museum, and all the exhibitions I was putting together and all the writing I did and everything. All these were motivated by deeply personal questions. Now I look back. I mean, I thought I was writing art history. I thought I was curating shows about art historical subjects that were intrinsically interesting. Well, they were, but they were intrinsically interesting to the questioning being within my soul. And it was very, very personal, even though it felt impersonal at the time. Objective history. Now I look back, it all joins up. That trajectory continues through your midlife, and there's a moment, if you're lucky, when somehow you become conscious of it. And this painting came right after that moment. In the sense, it's the end. It's the last painting of that trajectory, and that trajectory lasted nearly all my life. And so the question comes after that: do you get two trajectories, or was that it? I mean, there was a moment after I painted this where I thought, okay, I'm out. That's it. There's no point in making art anymore because it's done. I mean, I had no idea that I was nearly done until the moment of becoming conscious, and then I painted this painting, and it's an image of the end of the trajectory. It's pregnant with so much from the trajectory that it's a bit difficult to imagine how to begin to talk about it. But anyway. We're looking at, it's obviously phallic, but it's obviously vaginal. There's a figure that looks like it's a cloaked figure, but it's actually got kind of a phallic shape to it. This is the figure described in the white lines. But the way that the cloak opens, if that's what it is, has a kind of labial quality to it. In my imagination, as the painting was coming into being, the phallic column is divided vertically into four, so that there are splits, there are that kind of vaginal labial shape on the 4 points of the compass of that. So it's a phallus constructed from vaginas, or it's vaginas constructed out of the parts of a phallus, intrinsic to each other. I mean, you can just see at the top there that the head of the phallic shape seems to have these four segments to it, so it's kind of giving you a clue to how it's divided. But if you could walk around that phallic shape, you would see that there's a vaginal labial shape on the 4 points of the compass around that circle. When it was done, seemed to me to be the most astonishing creation of the unconscious in describing an androgynous state. Not a physically androgynous state. It was more describing my mental state. So that it seemed to me that the trajectory that I'd been on over that lifetime was to become an androgyne mentally, to become male-female, and that the project of the trajectory was in fact to become more female, because I was exceedingly male in my early years. You know, when I worked in the V&A as a museum curator, I was a professional intellectual. The life of the mind, of the rational mind, of that kind of intellectual mind, seems to me now, in the symbolism of the ancients, to be exceedingly male. That's not to say that there are not, it's universal, these things are spread between men and women, but it seems in the symbolism of the ancients that was symbolized as maleness. So it seems that, looking back now, that the project of the trajectory was to become more female, and in fact to be like 100% female and 100% male. And that's the essence of it. All sorts of other things crept in. So the kind of wavy line there around the base, as if it's the hem of whatever the garment is, when I said it was like a cape. The wavy line there is that tokamak energy pulse. Tokamak is a machine that is torus, like a donut, and within the donut hydrogen is placed, and then it's heated up, and around the ring of the torus there's magnets, and the magnets then squeeze the hydrogen down into a string. At the moment that it's squeezed down, it's got this kind of pinch to it. The purpose of the tokamak machine, it fuses the hydrogen atoms into helium atoms, and so it's essentially making the process that makes the sun shine here on the earth. So for some reason, that ring of energy inside the tokamak became my emblem, my symbol for the leading edge of the ripple of time. And yet there's something about its circular nature that I obviously connect with the fieldness, so the opposite of the particulate. And yet for a moment it's collapsed, it's a sort of wave collapse into the vertical part of it which describes the phallus. There's another kind of unity of polarities there. The field and the particle become one. Looking back, it just beggars belief. What else can I say? So what's going on with the crucifixion in the background? There's the cross, there's Christ on the cross. This hair is the hair of Mary Magdalene. There's an image, a crucifixion image that I have at home, where Mary Magdalene is in sexual union with Christ on the cross. I mean, it's an extraordinary idea, but I wanted to bring those feminine elements back into the Christian part of the iconography. For me, there's a sense that Christianity as constructed in the West has somehow lost its feminine component. So when at the Reformation the images of Mary as the Mother of God were removed from the churches, it seemed that a medieval congregation could worship the male in Christ and the female in his mother. And they are King and Queen of Heaven in the Catholic canon. But for Protestantism to remove the female seems to obviously relate to my sense of where my trajectory was coming from. But to bring back that feminine side. The background is actually Venice, the Doge's palace. Sue and I went to live in Venice right after we got married, and we lived there for a couple of years. So it's on the home turf. But also, now I look back, I mean, this makes my hair stand on end sometimes, if I had any anyway. Why did we choose Venice? Well, I had no idea Venice was a romantic place to go after we were married. And this, my God, it's a marriage. Now here's a marriage of symbolic elements, a falva. We got married, and then we chose to go and live in Venice. What is Venice? What's its mythological centre? The Venice myth, in its own mind, is that it is married to the sea, and it's the dry land marrying the ocean. So it's that ocean part of the left part of that painting we were looking at. The fieldness marrying the material particulate dryness. The ocean wet fieldness marrying the dry particulate material. I mean, how, it's always surprising how the unconscious comes up with these things without, and this was something that was discovered in the making of the painting. It wasn't as if I came to this. You couldn't come to this and pack it with all this symbolism. It had to happen organically as it was being painted. Who knows what the rest of it is? I mean, all these sort of weird skulls at the bottom, they're also like violet. The flower always has that kind of the shape of a skull. And these have become more skull-like in their painting. But what are they doing there? It's yet to be discovered. This is a painting I'm embarrassed to say was painted more than 10 years ago, and I still don't understand elements of it. But maybe they're representations of the dead. And the dead, for me, are not truly dead. the imprint of the experience of 500,000 generations of living beings. I was going to say of human beings, but this, in my mind, what we contain underneath that 2 mil deep layer of language and consciousness in the 1250 cubic centimetres of the rest of the brain goes back to the first brains. When were the first brains? Probably 500 million years ago. But there's an unbroken line between those first brains through all the species that we were before we became even primates. And then the pre-Homo sapiens line, and then Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, and all the myriad species of human before Homo sapiens sapiens, us with the 2 mil layer. Those are the dead. They're still alive in our psyches. The imprint of their experience in the world is encoded in the genes that give rise to our mental apparatus, the organs within the mind. So maybe there's light being thrown on them? I don't know. I mean, fingers crossed something will give me that moment of, that's what they are. Yeah, choosing colours, I don't really pay much attention to. I go with whatever seems to want to happen in choosing colours, and I don't think about it too much, but now you ask, I'm thinking, ooh.
That's the colour register of those photographs I make.
The guests. The way that the photographic paper, when the suns are hitting it, is a cooler blue, and then as the exposure falls off towards the edge of the photographic paper, it's a much warmer blue. It's almost as if that's one of that photographic series called The Guests. These brushstrokes here are the remnants of the kind of brushy beginning that you filmed me doing earlier. Those very colourful brushstrokes. This was a much more sombre one with just, just great strokes of greys in silver and slightly purple and blue. And it just went over the whole canvas. I think the thing should probably say is that that field of marks isn't a kind of doodle out of which these figures appear. The figures come almost, as I've described, as if it was a knock on the wall. So they're not emerging out of the doodling process of putting those marks down as a beginning. They're coming from the wings being the unconscious, I guess. And I just wait for an intuition that one of them wants to come into the work. It's interesting that the crane, this is a Japanese crane, the crane's head kind of coincides with this line coming out from the figures over there. So it's almost invisible that the head is here. She's the figure of what the Jungians would call the anima, and I would call that the dream sender, or remember I characterised her as a cross between the kind of Greek Sophia and the welcoming, unconditional, love-giving young Catholic Virgin. When there's blue in a figure like that, I always imagine that it's actually an aperture and that you can go through the figure into the blue sky, but also the blues of the Virgin, I guess. Mary's always dressed in blue. It's an ibex. And you know, these things are late additions. There's a moment in any painting, there's a moment when you suddenly feel in contact with what the subject is going to be. So when the blue figure began, I was still unsure what her role was in the painting. I mean, there seemed to be no reason for her to enter. And then after a few days, it suddenly hit me, oh my God, that's where she is. That's where she is. That's what she's attending. Now I know why she's there. And then suddenly the whole thing starts to unfold. That's an amazing feeling when you know, and it's coming out of you. The addition of the ibex there and these car bumpers from my old Saab 96 and the gondola head, and suddenly it all crashes in. And look, she's got solar images on her back, so she's almost a remnant of one of my guest figures. One of the first decisions was to put on the patches of orange and the patches of this plum sort of purple, just working out of mindless intuition, really. At the end of the day, I suddenly realised, oh my God, that orange is the orange of the Martian desert. And so many of my paintings have been set on Mars, metaphorical Mars, as it were. I've often dreamed of establishing on the illusory canals. Remember, Mars was famous for its canals in the 19th century, which turned out to be illusions. But my project is to found New Venice on the banks of the canals on Mars and bring about the greening of the planet. It's called terraforming in science fiction, making that high, dry desert warm and wet and bringing it down into an Earth-like state of green. The orange is still the Martian regolith on the left there. None of that was in my mind when this painting began, and yet it grows. It's a story that grows in the telling, and it's uncanny how many connections there are across time into all the rest of the works that have arrived in this way, and also to the 1,000 dreams that I've documented. And they're all published in this dream book, Nantucket Sleigh Ride, unedited transcription of every dream since 1986, and an essay which
meditates on some of the larger themes that are common to the dreams.
Although this comes out of a kind of daydream, it's analogous to the kind of things, the deeper themes that you see emerging in the dreams, in the night dreams. That's getting to the real centre of it.
Hard to speak about how the foundation, what does it mean that it was a promise made to somebody and then there's a sacred bond between you and that person because you want to keep the promise, and then it sacralizes everything. You suddenly realise that there is such a thing as that sacred bond, and then you can have a sacred relationship to everything. And it's that seeing as the world as sacred in some way that leads to art for me. And it leads to all the other bonds in my life, my marriage vows, the sacred vows of marriage. I don't think I would have been able to understand just how important they are without having had an experience of making a promise to somebody earlier on. And I thank my grandfather everlastingly for extracting that promise from me.
So my grandfather made me promise not to smoke. He attributed the cancer he had to his smoking when he was a youth. And I think he just wanted me not to suffer that. So how amazing that one thing should stick in the mind. Being faithful. I always find it hard to put into words why that makes a difference to the whole world. When you have a faithful relationship to a person who you made a promise to, somehow that extends way beyond that human relationship into just your attitude to all things in society. It makes you serious about everything is the right word. I don't know whether I'm serious, but it gives you that serious perspective, and you see, you see in a proper light. Well, just in the sense that gives you the foundation on which to build a life. Before that time, I was a drifter. And then I realised how wonderful a commitment could be to something. And then I was able to take life seriously and see it in all its splendour and marvel, and make a commitment to another person. And I found Sue, and here we are 30 odd years later.